I had always thought life would be smooth after getting married. I grew up in a loving but modest home, and despite the loss of my parents in my late teens, I carried their values with me: kindness, humility, and strength. My husband, Ethan, had swept me off my feet during our college years. He was charming, ambitious, and seemingly the perfect partner. At first, his family seemed welcoming enough. His mother, Eleanor, would flash a polite smile, though it never quite reached her eyes. His father, Gerald, was a man of few words, but his disapproving glances often lingered a little too long. Still, I chose to see the best in them because I loved Ethan. We moved into the large family estate soon after our wedding, as per Eleanor's insistence. She claimed it was only temporary until we could save for our own home. It seemed generous at first, but little did I know, I was walking into a gilded cage. Things started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I began to notice how Eleanor would frequently compare me to their family friends' daughters-in-law, who were doctors, lawyers, or heirs to substantial fortunes. You know, Olivia managed to host a charity gala for 300 guests all by herself, Eleanor once said, her tone dripping with feigned admiration. Isn't that impressive, Ethan? I smiled, feeling the sting but brushing it off. That does sound impressive, I replied. She's a natural, Eleanor continued, her gaze cutting into me. Not everyone has the upbringing for it. Ethan didn't defend me, he didn't even notice. It was easier to let these comments slide than to start a conflict. At least, that's what I told myself. Soon, Eleanor began treating me less like a family member and more like staff. She'd leave lists of tasks for me to complete during the day, ironing their clothes, polishing the silverware, and preparing dinner. Initially, I tried to comply, thinking it was a way to earn her approval, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One evening, after spending hours preparing a 3-course meal for the family, Eleanor frowned as she tasted the soup. It's too salty, she declared, pushing the bowl aside. Do it again tomorrow, and please, follow the recipe this time. Ethan said nothing, he didn't even meet my eyes. Ethan's long hours at work left me alone in a house that didn't feel like home. I tried to focus on hobbies, even attempted to make friends in the area, but Eleanor discouraged me. Your place is here, she said one day when I mentioned wanting to join a local art class. There's plenty to keep you busy at home. I realized then that she didn't see me as her son's wife, an equal partner in life. She saw me as an inconvenience, a mistake Ethan had made by marrying beneath their station. But I still held on to hope. I loved Ethan, and I believed he loved me. Surely, he would see how his family was treating me and put a stop to it, wouldn't he? The turning point came during a family dinner. Gerald invited one of his business associates, a powerful and wealthy man named Mr. Hawkins. As we prepared for the evening, Eleanor's instructions became relentless. Make sure the linens are pressed perfectly, she snapped, and don't embarrass us in front of Mr. Hawkins. He values class, and you're still learning. Her words stung, but I nodded and set the table with care. When Mr. Hawkins arrived, I was introduced briefly, before being relegated to the kitchen. I overheard snippets of their conversation as I served hors d'oeuvres. She's very lucky to be part of this family, Gerald was saying. Ethan is too kind, he could have married anyone, but he has such a big heart. The implication was clear, I was a charity case. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my composure. The night dragged on, and by the end, I was left cleaning up alone. Ethan didn't even offer to help. I finally broke down in the dimly lit kitchen, tears streaming down my face as I scrubbed dishes, wondering how my life had come to this. I didn't know it then, but that dinner would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The aftermath of the dinner left me emotionally drained. My days were starting to blur together, each one a copy of the last: cleaning, cooking, and being invisible in a house that should have been my sanctuary. But something about that night lingered in the back of my mind, an invisible weight pressing down on me. A week after the dinner, Eleanor summoned me to the living room. She was seated on the ornate couch, a cup of tea in her hand. Gerald stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed, wearing his usual look of quiet disdain. We'll be hosting Mr. Hawkins again, Eleanor announced. It's important that we make a good impression this time. Gerald has been working on a significant deal with him, and we can't afford to let anything go wrong. I swallowed hard. Of course, what do you need from me? Everything to be perfect, she replied, her voice cool. And this time, try not to look so plain. Presentation matters. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, but nodded. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel the weight of their expectations. I wasn't just a wife in their eyes, I was a pawn in their endless pursuit of social status. The day of the dinner arrived, and I worked tirelessly from dawn. The house gleamed, the table was set with the finest china, and the aroma of roasted lamb filled the air. By the time the guests arrived, I was exhausted, but Eleanor insisted I be presentable. As Mr. Hawkins stepped through the door, his presence seemed to command the room. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an air of authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, a mix of recognition and shock, but just as quickly, it was gone. Dinner began, and I quietly served the courses, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As I placed a dish in front of Mr. Hawkins, he looked up and said, "Thank you, miss. Have we met before?" The question caught me off guard. I stammered, I don't think so." He tilted his head slightly, as though trying to place me. "You look familiar." Eleanor intervened, her tone sharp. "She's Ethan's wife. She tends to stay out of the spotlight." Mr. Hawkins didn't respond but gave me a small, polite nod. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me. The next morning, while cleaning up the dining room, I heard a knock at the front door. Expecting it to be a delivery, I opened it without much thought. To my surprise, it was Mr. Hawkins. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but firm. "May I speak with you?" I hesitated. "Of course, should I get Gerald?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I came to see you." He stepped inside, and I led him to the sitting room, my mind racing. What could he possibly want? As he sat down, he studied me carefully. "I was up all night thinking," he began. "I couldn't shake the feeling that I've seen you before." I frowned, unsure where this was going. "I don't think we've met." "Perhaps not directly," he said, pulling out his phone. "But does this look familiar?" He showed me a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was of my parents. They were younger, smiling brightly at what looked like a formal event, and standing next to them was a younger version of Mr. Hawkins. How do you have this?" I whispered. "I was close friends with your parents many years ago," he said, his voice softening. "Your father and I worked together, and your mother was like a sister to me. When I saw you last night, I couldn't believe my eyes." "You're their daughter, aren't you?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "Yes, but they passed away years ago." He leaned back, his expression a mix of sorrow and relief. "I had no idea. They spoke of you often, how proud they were of you. I lost touch with them after they moved, and I always regretted it." For the first time in years, I felt seen. Mr. Hawkins' words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness I had been drowning in. He asked about my life, and I hesitated to share too much, but something about his genuine concern made me open up. "I'm glad I found you," he said finally. "Your parents were extraordinary people, and I owe them so much. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." I nodded, still overwhelmed by the revelation. As he left, he gave me one last look and said, "You deserve better than this." Those words echoed in my mind long after he was gone. In the days following Mr. Hawkins' visit, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. His words lingered in my mind, offering a faint sense of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone in this world. My parents' memory, through him, became a thread connecting me to something greater, a sense of belonging that I had lost. Eleanor, however, wasn't blind to the change in me. While I continued my duties, something about my demeanor must have shifted. One morning, as I was scrubbing the kitchen counters, she approached me with her usual air of superiority. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Not that you're one for conversation, but you seem distracted." I shook my head quickly. "I've just been tired." She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Well, keep your focus. We're hosting another dinner next week. Gerald's promotion depends on securing Mr. Hawkins' partnership." My heart sank. Another dinner? The idea of being paraded around like a servant again made me nauseous. But then I remembered Mr. Hawkins' parting words, "You deserve better than this." A few days before the scheduled dinner, I found an envelope addressed to me on the hall table. It wasn't the type of thing Eleanor or Gerald would bother with. They never acknowledged my personal life. Curious, I opened it and was stunned to find a handwritten letter from Mr. Hawkins. "Dear Ava, it was truly a shock to see you again, but also a blessing. Your parents were dear to me, and I can't bear the thought of their daughter being treated unfairly. I have arranged for an opportunity that I believe could change your circumstances. If you're willing, come to my office this Friday at noon. I'll explain everything." Warm regards. Daniel Hawkins. My hands trembled as I read the letter. Could this really be happening? Was this the lifeline I had been praying for? Friday arrived, and I could barely contain my nerves. I told Eleanor I had errands to run and left the house, clutching the letter like a talisman. As I entered Mr. Hawkins' office building, my heart raced. The receptionist guided me to his office, where he greeted me with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, gesturing for me to sit. He explained that he had connections in a nearby nonprofit organization that supported women in difficult situations. He believed they could help me build a new life, one where I could rediscover my sense of self-worth and independence. "But there's more," he said, leaning forward. "Your parents left behind a trust fund in your name. I helped them set it up years ago, but I lost track of it when they passed. It's modest, but it's enough to give you a fresh start." Tears streamed down my face as I listened. The idea of starting over felt like a distant dream finally within reach. That evening, I returned home with renewed resolve. I knew Eleanor and Gerald would never let me go easily, they thrived on control, but now, I had something they didn't know about, a plan, a future, and the means to escape. I began quietly packing a few belongings, hiding them in the attic. Each day, I worked discreetly to gather what I would need. The upcoming dinner felt like the perfect cover. While their attention was focused on impressing Mr. Hawkins, I could slip away unnoticed. As the dinner approached, I found myself smiling more often, even humming as I worked. Eleanor noticed but misinterpreted it as compliance. "Good," she said with a rare nod of approval. "You're finally understanding your place." If only she knew. The evening of the dinner arrived, bringing with it a storm of nerves and anticipation. Eleanor was in full command mode, barking orders at everyone to ensure perfection. Gerald, for his part, was too busy rehearsing his business pitch to Mr. Hawkins to notice anything out of the ordinary. I moved about the house methodically, my heart racing with each passing moment. Tonight would be my last night here. Guests began arriving, including Mr. Hawkins, who greeted me with a knowing smile. His presence was a reminder of the escape plan I'd meticulously crafted. The atmosphere in the dining room buzzed with polite chatter and the clinking of glasses. As expected, Eleanor had instructed me to stay in the kitchen, serving dishes and refilling drinks. But Mr. Hawkins wasn't content to let me stay in the shadows. "Ava," he called out when I entered with a platter of appetizers, "why don't you join us? After all, we've got much to talk about." Eleanor's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. "Oh, there's no need for that," she said hastily, laughing nervously. "She's here to help, not to dine." But Mr. Hawkins wasn't deterred. "I insist," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Ava is like family to me. I won't have her treated otherwise." The room fell silent. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Eleanor sputtered for a response. Reluctantly, they allowed me to sit. I could feel Eleanor's eyes burning into me, but I kept my composure, buoyed by Mr. Hawkins' support. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to my parents. Mr. Hawkins shared stories about them, how my father had been his closest friend and how my mother's kindness had touched everyone she met. For the first time in years, I felt like they weren't just a distant memory, they were alive in the room, in the words of someone who had truly known them. It was then that Mr. Hawkins dropped the bombshell. "Ava," he said, addressing me directly, "have you told them about the trust fund your parents left for you?" My heart stopped. I glanced at Eleanor and Gerald, whose expressions twisted from confusion to shock. "Trust fund?" Gerald repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Mr. Hawkins continued, turning his gaze to them. "Her parents left her a considerable amount to ensure she'd never have to rely on anyone else. I'm appalled to see how that generosity has been ignored." Eleanor stammered, trying to regain control. We weren't aware. She never mentioned it." I met her gaze for the first time that evening, my voice steady. "Because you never asked." The tension in the room was palpable. Gerald tried to defuse it, laughing nervously. "Well, this is a misunderstanding. Of course, Ava will have access to her funds. Isn't that right, Eleanor?" But Eleanor's veneer cracked. "She's ungrateful. After everything we've done for her, giving her a roof, food, this is how she repays us?" Mr. Hawkins interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "If by roof and food, you mean exploitation and mistreatment, then yes, Eleanor, this is how she repays you, by reclaiming her life." For the first time, I saw Eleanor rendered speechless. Gerald, too, slumped in his chair, his bluster evaporating. After dinner, I quietly gathered the bag I had packed and headed for the door. Mr. Hawkins followed, offering me a ride to the apartment he had arranged for me through his nonprofit connections. As I left, I felt a mixture of emotions: relief, empowerment, and a bittersweet sense of closure. Eleanor and Gerald didn't even try to stop me. They must have realized their grip on me was broken. The next morning, I woke up in a small but cozy apartment, my apartment. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I started attending workshops at the nonprofit, where I learned skills to rebuild my life. Mr. Hawkins continued to be a mentor, guiding me through the process of managing the trust fund and pursuing my dreams. Most importantly, I began to find myself again. I wasn't just someone's servant or charity case. I was Ava, a woman with a future. Months later, I sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and reading a book. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility. I thought of my parents often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. They had given me the strength to endure, and now I was finally living the life they had wanted for me. As for Eleanor and Gerald, I heard through the grapevine that Gerald didn't get his promotion. It seemed karma had its own way of balancing the scales. But I wasn't focused on them anymore. My life was ahead of me, and I was ready to embrace it.